What's good, guys? It's your boy Beats by Ash coming at you with another banger of a video, and today I'm going to be bringing you guys my complete event counter / trigger guide for each color in the One Piece card game. I wanted to bring this to your attention because I haven't really seen anyone put any content out for this, and I think it's a very integral part of competitive play. So today I'm going to be teaching you how we can play around our opponent using events during our turn, as well as them utilizing a trigger effect whenever a damage is dealt to their leader. If you like this video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and let me know down below what you want to see next, and let's get into the goo. So I want to go ahead and start off talking about red because I think it's one of the more integral strategies where it's important for you to understand how to play around your opponent having certain event counters in order for you to win. So when you're going against a Luffy or a Zoro leader, there are two main event counters that they could have. One being the 1-cost guard point, and the second being the 2-cost Gum Gum Red Hawk. Now, the way we differentiate between these is obviously by how much Dawn our opponent left up on our turn. If they have 1, I like to play around guard point if possible, and same for Gum Gum Red Hawk if they have 2, and if they have more than 2, it's very likely if they have cards in hand that they are representing a combination of both, as typically red players are going to use as much Dawn as they can to effectively attack with as many units as possible. So when we look at guard point, it gives a leader or character plus 3k during one battle and has a trigger effect to give something plus 1k during this turn. So in order for us to interact with the counter effect, if they have something that we really want to kill and they really want to protect, I suggest putting your character or leader 4k above whatever the threshold is for you to hit. That way, at least if they use this card, then you are at least getting 2 cards out of that exchange. Similarly to if you pumped your character to a magic number such as 7 or 9 that you have probably heard people talk about before. Now for the trigger effect, I recommend attacking with your lowest possible character you think you can get a hit in with on their leader first, if you want to play around this. That way, if they do give the plus 1k to their leader, you have to spend less Dawn to buff up the rest of your attackers. Now, Red Hawk is the one that's a bit more tricky. If you mess up your sequence on your attacks during your turn, you're going to end up with a huge tempo loss and in a lot of situations, not going to be able to come back. So what I like to do is 2 different approaches. Number 1, let's say you have something like a 4k Nico Robin and you don't want to spend any Dawn on it. You could just attack like their Bonnie or their Nami. I mean, not Bonnie, but you could attack their, low cost character and not use any effects on it, not use any Dawn. That way you've already gotten your attack in with that 4k or less character. So even if they use this counter later on, they're not getting any additional value from it besides an additional body removed. And the second way you can play around it, probably the more efficient way, is if you have enough Dawn, buff all of your characters that are 4k or below to 5k. That way, if they activate this, they actually just get no value on that. They're just paying 2 for a 4k, which is still good, but not nearly as problematic. Now, the trigger effect to give something minus 10k power during this turn, it's very up to each game state how you can play around this, but to give you one example, let's say you use your leader to attack their leader and you have Zoro in hand. Well, if you do that interaction first, all they can do is target your leader, reduce its power, but you've already attacked. Whereas if you had put the Zoro on field first and then did that, they could reduce it, and then one of your units would not be able to get a attack in that turn. So very important to understand about that, but for the most part, it's a super annoying card. Okay, now I wanted to briefly mention 2 cards that are also popular that are not counters, but they do have a integral trigger ability that can set you far back. One being Diable Jambe. The best way for you to play around this effect being KO an opponent character with 3 or less that has blocker is attack with your blocker first if you can. You know, it's pretty straightforward there. And then with Gum Gum Jet Pistol, this card, you're often not going to be able to play around it because it's extremely busted. But if you can, obviously buff something above the 6k threshold, or if you have one character that meets that criteria for the Jet Pistol to kill, then attack with that character first. That way you already got the damage in and you don't really care. Okay, now moving on to blue. This color is not as integral for you to understand, but the main thing I want you to take away here is it can be deceiving how much kill potential you have against a blue leader. The main two I'm going to be referring to are Love Beam and Desert Spada, which are commonly found in both Doflamingo and starter deck Crocodile. For Desert Spada, one thing you need to understand is that they can use this ability in conjunction with the Love Beam in order to stack the deck and then draw cards if they meet both of the criteria. But essentially, you need to understand that they're probably going to stack their deck with a 2k, potentially draw it. Likewise with Love Beam, especially if they're playing Doflamingo, there's a very high chance that if they're manipulating the deck correctly, that they set another Love Beam right after the one they just played. So if they have 4 Dawn, I think it's very telegraphed at times to think that they could be giving someone +8, as you can use a counter, then resolve a counter, and as well, you can use counters in hand that aren't events before using an event, so you can put yourself down to that 3-card threshold to draw with the Love Beam before actually gaining the effect, which can often lead to you protecting with 10 or 12k power. Now, as far as Desert Spada's trigger ability, it's not something you really can play around, more so just something that you can account for, that there is a slight chance the person gets an additional counter. So if you have the opportunity to expend an additional Dawn or 2 on your turn that you're trying to go for lethal, then it's probably a little bit better, if you can afford that, to invest more resources just to secure a game. There is one final card in blue I thought I might mention because it can be teched into Crocodile or Doflamingo depending on the build. While it isn't commonly seen, it gives you more ability to play around. So it has a trigger ability that can return something back to hand that costs 4 or less. So obviously, similarly to Gum Gum Redhawk, if we have the opportunity to do so, I would recommend attacking with that 4 or less character first before you attack with your bigger and higher cost characters. That way, if they do get this trigger ability, that they do not nullify one of your attacks. Okay, so when looking at purple, there are really 2 main counters that we need to look out for, one being Blast Breath and the second one being Thunder Bagua. Now, Blast Breath is a 1 cost that gives something plus 4k, which is probably one of the best counters in any color currently. And Thunder Bagua is more of a card that you will see less often than Blast Breath, but it is a card that does come up. It also gives 4k, but if they're at 2 or less life, they'll be adding a Dawn to their Dawn deck and resting it. And for the most part with purple, there's not a lot about how those cards can interfere with you attacking, but it's more so about how they could set up on the following turn. So if they're representing 1 or 2, typically these people are going to have the Blast Breath, but not always the Thunder Bagua because it isn't played in every list, and especially not a 4 of, where Blast Breath has commonly been a staple. And for most of the trigger effects in Kaido, or purple in general, they're mostly effects that give you additional Dawn, which helps them out for next turn. So the main thing we're looking for here is, if we're trying to trade with their board, do we have enough to excess over that 4k threshold, which seems to be a common theme around most of the purple counters? As well, can we actually go for lethal here? Because if we leave them at 1 life or 2 life and they use a Thunder Bagua, will them ramping an additional Dawn for next turn allow them to maybe play a 10 cost Kaido or a 7 cost King in a situation where we did not think that was any longer possible because they only had 1 or 2 up. So that's kind of the main takeaway there is, what could an additional Dawn do for our opponent in terms of triggers? And that's why I have the Brachio Bomber on there as well, because we have seen some topping lists use 1 copy to 2 copies of Brachio Bomber in recent times, and even though it's not a counter ability, it is still something that could come up. Okay, so when taking a look at green, there are 2 very common counters that will come up in your kid matchups as well as your Kazuki Odin. One being the 1 cost Paradise Waterfall and the second being the 2 cost Punk Gibson. So Paradise Waterfall gives something 2k, then set something as active, which can be a little bit tricky because our opponent can reset certain characters that we wanted to attack. So something important to know is, let's say we really want to kill someone's Bonnie and we want to attack it with one of our characters. One way I like to play around this is put additional Dawn on it, and it may seem as overkill, but if you can expend the resource and they're representing 1, it's oftentimes worth it, because if not, and they're able to use enough counter from hand to stop that attack, they can then set their Momo or their Bonnie back to the unrested position, which will allow them to continue getting free searches and more value, maybe even searching another copy of this card on the following turn. In terms of its trigger effect, KOing a rested character with a cost of 4 or less, you may have already attacked with a character who is in that position, but there are times where maybe you're playing Law in your deck and you're able to bounce something back to your hand that is tapped, and in those situations that's always never a bad idea if you're in the right opportunity. It's one of those things where it doesn't come up a lot, but it is something to consider. Now, when we look at Punk Gibson, giving someone 4k is a very common occurrence in this set, and the second effect allows them to rest one of your characters with 4 or less. This is very similar to that Red Hawk effect that I have alluded to in each color, which means that we need to attack with our unit that has 4 or less cost first if we are going to do so at all that turn. That way they're not able to get any additional value by resting that character. And as well, the trigger effect allows you to rest any of your opponent's characters. So if you want to play around that and you're going for game, always recommend attacking with the character that you want to secure getting that damage in first. That way they don't just rest it and you're left with something that you don't even have enough Dawn to effectively break through that wall that they seem to set up. Now, lastly, I wanted to go ahead and mention these 3 characters on their own, as they are not events, but they all have a trigger ability that is worth playing around if you have the opportunity. So I didn't mention them with the others because they're not events, like I said, and also they all have a similar effect, so I thought it'd be best to talk about them here. So all of these kind of punish you for having a low cost character on the board, which, you know, really alludes to that theme that's kind of going on with 1 counter specifically in each color, like that Red Hawk effect that we've been talking about. So you want to attack with that low cost character first in terms of the Jinbei as well as the Who's Who. Before the killer, you know, you would prefer to attack with the lowest cost person last, which kind of contradicts your playing around Punk Gibson. So, I mean, do with that what you will. These are more situational, aren't always played in the decks that you would see the other counters in, more of tech cards dependent on the meta that your locals may switch out depending on who shows up. So that's going to be all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for getting this far in the video. I really appreciate it, and make sure to leave a like on this video and let me know what you want to see next. As always, if it's not the goo, it's got to go. Peace.
Ooh, is that indigo?